The wind over the Wyoming grasslands had a voice. Eli Dawson knew its language well. It was a lonesome tongue, whispering of endless space and forgotten sorrows. It was the only voice he tolerated most nights, the only one that did not ask for anything in return. He sat on the porch of the small, sturdy cabin his brother had built, a tin cup of whiskey warming his calloused hands. The wood of the chair was smooth with wear, the porch boards groaning softly under his weight, sounds as familiar as his own breathing. This land was not his, not really. It belonged to his brother, Jacob, or what was left of him, buried under a simple wooden cross on the rise behind the house. Jacob had seen promise here. Eli only saw a place to disappear. He tended the small herd of cattle, fixed the fences, and chopped the wood. His days measured by the sun's slow arc across a sky too big for one man's guilt. The work was hard and honest, and it was the only prayer he had left. It kept the ghosts at bay until sundown. When darkness fell, they came creeping back. They were in the sigh of the wind, the shadows that danced at the edge of his lamplight, the bitter burn of the whiskey at the back of his throat. He was a rugged man, broad in the shoulder and lean in the hip, his face a map of hard miles and harder memories. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, rarely met another's, and his words were few and deliberate, as if he feared they might betray the turmoil he kept locked inside. The war had taken much from him, but it was the peace that followed, the supposed peace that had carved out his soul. Betrayal had a sharper edge than any saber. He trusted the silence. He trusted the ache in his muscles after a long day's ride. He did not trust people. He drained the last of the whiskey, the raw heat a familiar comfort. He stood, his joints stiff, and went inside. The cabin was sparse, a table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and a bed in the corner. Jacob's bed. Eli slept on a cot near the hearth, as if he were still a guest, a temporary sentinel watching over another man's dream. He banked the fire, the embers glowing like dying stars, and lay down on the cot, pulling a rough wool blanket over his shoulders. He did not undress. He never knew when he might have to run. Sleep did not come easy. It was not a place of rest, but a battlefield where the old wars were fought again and again. Tonight, the wind carried the smell of snow, and the ghosts were restless. He was back on the plains of western Kansas, the air thick with dust and the metallic scent of blood. The uniform of the United States Cavalry felt tight and strange, a costume for a part he no longer wished to play. He was young then, not yet broken, riding alongside men who believed in the righteousness of their cause. They were hunting raiders, men who had burned and pillaged a settlement a week prior. Their orders were clear: engage and eliminate. Their scout, a man whose thirst for whiskey was surpassed only by his thirst for vengeance against any man with dark skin, pointed toward a small encampment nestled in a shallow canyon. Smoke curled into the twilight sky, the flicker of a campfire, figures moving in the growing darkness. "That's them," the scout had hissed, his eyes glinting. "Cheyenne dogs. Got the stolen goods with them. I'd wager." They did not question him. They were a hammer, and everything looked like a nail. The command was given, a bugle's sharp cry splitting the evening quiet, and they charged. Hoofbeats thundered against the earth, a sound like God's own rage. Eli's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. He gripped his rifle, the cold metal a familiar anchor in the storm of chaos. They swept into the camp, yelling, firing, a wave of blue-coated fury. It was over in minutes. The resistance was slight, confused. As the smoke cleared, and the last echoes of gunfire faded into the vast silence of the prairie, the truth revealed itself in the flickering firelight. It was a horror Eli could never unsee. These were not raiders. They were settlers, a small band of German immigrants, their wagon broken, making camp for the night. Men, women, children. Their faces, pale and terrified in the moments before death, were now slack and empty. A woman lay near the fire, a half-knitted stocking still in her hand, her blue eyes wide with a final, terrible surprise. A young boy, no older than 10, was slumped against a wagon wheel, a tin soldier clutched in his small fist. The scout was gone, vanished into the darkness he had led them into. The captain's face was a mask of ash. The men stood in stunned silence, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and scorched innocence. Eli felt a scream building in his throat, a raw, animal sound of revulsion and guilt. But he choked it down. It remained there still, a hard knot of poison in his gut. That was the day he learned that a uniform could not make a man righteous, and an order could not make him clean. It was the ghost he saw most often, the woman with the gentle, surprised eyes, a silent accuser in the court of his memory. The stagecoach rattled and swayed, each jolt a fresh torment to Celia Hartwell's bruised dignity. She sat ramrod straight, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the passing blur of dull, brown land. The other passengers, a portly salesman and a dour-faced couple, had given her a wide berth after learning her name in the last town. She could feel their stares, their whispered condemnations. Hartwell, the woman from Charleston, the one they said had put arsenic in her husband's evening brandy. She was a Southerner, born to a world of manicured gardens and hushed drawing rooms, a world that had cast her out with brutal efficiency. Her late husband, a man twice her age with a cruel streak as wide as the Mississippi, had been a pillar of society. His death had been sudden, and the rumors, fueled by his resentful family, had spread like wildfire. Though a court had found no evidence to convict her, society had passed its own sentence. She was a pariah, a disgrace. Her family had given her a small sum of money and a one-way ticket west, a polite but firm command to disappear and never tarnish their name again. Her fine silk traveling dress was dusty and creased, a relic of a life that no longer existed, beneath the veneer of composure. A quiet desperation gnawed at her. She was seeking work as a housekeeper at the Rocking R, a large ranch owned by a man her father had once known. It was a humiliating descent, but it was all she had left. The ranch was vast, the main house a sprawling monument to one man's ambition. A hard-faced man with cold, assessing eyes met her on the porch. He listened to her request, his expression unreadable. When she mentioned her name, a flicker of recognition, of contempt, crossed his face. "Hartwell," he repeated, the name tasting like something foul in his mouth. "I've heard of you." He looked her up and down, taking in her worn but elegant attire, her refined speech. "We need a woman who can scrub floors and wring a chicken's neck. Mrs. Hartwell, not one who knows her way around a poison bottle." The word struck her like a physical blow. She flinched, her face paling. "That was a lie," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "I was acquitted." "Makes no difference to me," the man said, turning away. "We don't want your kind of trouble here. The stage leaves in the morning. I suggest you be on it." He went inside, the slam of the door echoing the finality of her exile. Celia stood on the porch, trembling, as the cold afternoon wind whipped around her, pulling at her hair and chilling her to the bone. The sky was turning a bruised shade of purple, the clouds gathering heavy and low. She had nowhere to go. Her money was nearly gone. For the first time in her life, Celia Hartwell was truly, utterly alone, with the specter of a winter storm threatening to swallow her whole. Miles away, another kind of storm had already broken. The air was filled with screams, the crackle of flames, and the sharp retort of gunfire. Maria Reyes ran, her lungs burning, her bare feet stumbling over the rocky ground. Smoke clawed at her throat, and tears streamed from her eyes, carving clean paths through the soot that stained her face. She had been part of a small caravan, traveling north from New Mexico. She was a mail-order bride, sold by her uncle for $100 to a man she had never met, a miner in Wyoming. She had not wanted to go, But the choice had not been hers. Her life had been a series of closed doors, of choices made for her by men who saw her as property. This journey, as frightening as it was, held a tiny, flickering ember of hope. Perhaps this man, this stranger, would be kind. Perhaps anything was better than the life she was leaving behind. They had been attacked at dusk. Raiders, their faces hidden by bandanas, had descended upon the caravan with savage speed. They were after the payroll wagon, but their cruelty was indiscriminate. Maria had seen the wagon master shot down, had watched in horror as the other woman in their party was dragged away, screaming. A flaming torch had been tossed onto her wagon, the canvas cover erupting in a whoosh of orange flame. Panic, stark and absolute, had given her speed. She had scrambled out the back, her small bundle of possessions left behind, and fled into the wilderness. Gunfire chased her, the sound of bullets whining past her ears. She did not look back. She ran until her legs gave out, until the sounds of the raid faded behind her, replaced by the pounding of her own heart and the ragged rasp of her breathing. She wandered for what felt like an eternity, lost and half dead from fear and exhaustion. Her dress was torn and scorched. Her feet were cut and bleeding. The cold seeped into her bones, a deep, numbing ache. She was feverish, the world tilting and swaying around her. She did not know if she had been running for hours or for days. Time had dissolved into a single, unending moment of survival. Just as she was about to surrender to the encroaching darkness, to lie down and let the cold take her, she saw it, a light, a small, yellow square of light in the distance, a beacon in the vast, unforgiving emptiness. A ranch, hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. She stumbled toward it, her last reserves of strength focused on that single point of light. She did not make it to the house. The barn, a dark, looming shape against the snow-dusted ground, was as far as she could go. She pulled open the heavy door, the scent of hay and animals washing over her, a smell of life. She crawled up into the hayloft, burrowing into the loose hay like a wounded animal seeking a place to die. Then the world went black. Eli found her the next morning. He had gone to the barn to feed the horses, the first flakes of a coming storm swirling in the air. A piece of scorched calico snagged on the ladder to the loft caught his eye. He was a cautious man. Anything out of the ordinary was a threat until proven otherwise. With a hand resting on the pistol at his hip, he climbed the ladder. She was so still he thought she was dead. A small, dark-haired woman, half buried in the hay, her face pale and smudged with soot. Her dress was in tatters, and he could see the dark, dried blood on her bare feet. He knelt beside her, his fingers going to the pulse point on her neck. It was there, a faint, thready flutter against his rough skin. A sigh escaped his lips, a sound of weary resignation. Trouble had found him, as it always did. His first instinct was to leave her, to ride to town and fetch the sheriff. But the town was a half-day's ride, and the snow was starting to fall in earnest. She would be dead by the time anyone got back. He looked down at her face, at the long, dark lashes resting against her pale cheeks. She looked young and lost. He thought of the woman from his nightmare, the one with the surprised eyes, cursing under his breath. He gently scooped the woman into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, her body limp and feverishly warm against his. He carried her to the house, the wind biting at his face. He laid her on his own cot by the fire, pulling the blanket over her. He did not know what to do. He was a man who mended fences and broke horses, not one who tended to the sick. He fetched a basin of water and a clean rag and gently began to wash the soot from her face. As he worked, her eyes fluttered open. They were dark and wide with terror. A string of Spanish, rapid and panicked, tumbled from her lips. "Easy now," he said, his voice gruff. "You're safe." She flinched at the sound of his voice, trying to scramble away, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar cabin like a cornered animal. The effort was too much. She moaned softly and slipped back into unconsciousness. Eli stood there, the damp rag in his hand, feeling a profound sense of intrusion. His sanctuary had been breached. As if the day had not brought enough disruption, a sharp knock echoed from the front door. He froze, his hand instinctively going to his gun again. He was not expecting anyone. No one ever came to his door. He moved to the door and opened it a crack, his body blocking the view of the cabin's interior. A woman stood on his porch, her shoulders hunched against the wind. Even in her distress, she carried herself with a straight-backed pride that seemed out of place in this rough country. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue, but her eyes, a startling shade of green, met his without fear. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying the soft, melodic cadence of the South. "I apologize for the intrusion. My name is Celia Hartwell. I find myself without shelter. And the storm. It is getting worse. I ask only for a place to stay out of the wind for the night. I can pay." Eli looked from her refined, desperate face to the swirling snow that was already beginning to obscure the landscape. He had one wounded, unconscious woman on his cot. Now another stood on his porch. He felt the walls of his solitude closing in, the silence he cherished being shattered by the needs of strangers. He wanted to say no. He wanted to close the door and pretend he had never seen her. But he looked at the sky, and he looked at her face, and he saw the same quiet desperation he felt in his own soul. He let out a long, slow breath. "One night," he said, his voice flat and hard. "That's all. When the storm breaks, you both leave." He opened the door wider, stepping aside to let her in. Celia Hartwell stepped across the threshold, bringing the scent of the cold and a world of troubles Eli could not yet imagine. Her eyes fell upon the woman on the cot, and she stopped short, her breath catching in her throat. The fierce Wyoming wind howled outside, and the snow began to fall in a thick, white curtain, erasing the road, the fences, the entire world. It trapped the three of them in the small log cabin, the haunted cowboy, the disgraced widow, and the broken bride. The fire crackled in the hearth, a lone point of warmth in a room suddenly thick with silence, secrets, and the simmering tension of three disparate lives thrown together in the heart of a storm. The world outside the cabin vanished. For 3 days, a blizzard raged, a white fury that erased the horizon and piled snow in great drifts against the door and windows. Inside, the small space became their entire universe, charged with the dense silence of strangers bound by a storm. Time was measured not by the sun, but by the dwindling wood pile and the level of coffee in the pot. The air was thick with the scent of pine smoke, damp wool, and unspoken histories. Eli moved with a grim, restless energy, a caged animal pacing the confines of his den. He chopped wood he did not need, piling it high on the porch, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound he offered. He cleaned his rifle, oiled his saddle, his hands never still, his eyes always distant. He was acutely aware of the two women, of the rustle of their skirts, their soft, foreign presence in his starkly masculine world. They were an invasion of his grief, and he did not know what to do with them. Celia was a study in taut composure, her fear and desperation hidden behind a mask of cool civility. She rationed their food with a careful hand, her movements economical and precise. She sat by the fire, mending a tear in her dress with thread pulled from its own hem, her posture as erect as if she were in a Charleston parlor. But Eli saw the tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking, the way her gaze would fix on the swirling snow outside the window, her expression one of utter desolation. Maria remained on the cot, drifting in and out of a fevered sleep. She spoke only in Spanish, her words disjointed and fearful. Pleas to a mother or a saint Eli could not understand. It was Celia who tended to her. She bathed Maria's face with cool water, coaxed sips of broth between her cracked lips, and spoke to her in a low, soothing murmur. the English words meaningless but the tone a universal language of comfort. Eli watched from a distance, a silent observer. He saw a tenderness in Celia he would not have expected, a gentle competence that seemed at odds with the rumors that clung to her like a shroud. He had offered his home as a shield against the storm, but within its walls, he was the one who felt exposed. On the fourth morning, the wind died. The silence was absolute, profound. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the grimy window pane, illuminating a world transformed, buried under a blanket of pristine white. Maria's fever had broken. She woke with clear, dark eyes, her gaze lucid and filled with a deep, weary apprehension. She looked from Celia's watchful face to Eli, who stood by the hearth, his expression guarded. The truce of the storm was over. The silence now was not one of awe, but of uncertainty. Finally, Eli spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "The snow is deep. It'll be a week, maybe more, before the pass is clear." He looked at Celia, then at Maria. "You can stay, but I have rules." He laid them out, his words as stark and unyielding as the winter landscape. "You will work. This is not a boarding house. You will pull your own weight." He paused, his gaze hardening. "And you will not ask questions. My life, my past, it is not your concern. You are here for shelter. Nothing more. When the snow melts, you will be on your way." Celia met his gaze without flinching, a flicker of her old pride returning. "That is more than fair. Mr. Dawson, I am not afraid of work." She rose, her movement stiff but resolute. "And I prefer to earn my keep." From that moment, she took possession of the cabin's domestic life. She seemed driven by a need to create order from the chaos, to scrub away the grime of both the house and her own sullied reputation. She swept the floors, washed the few dishes with a fierce energy, and organized Eli's sparse supplies. She found a sack of flour and baked biscuits that filled the small space with a smell so much like a home it made Eli's chest ache. She was relentless, as if by cleaning the physical space, she could somehow purify her own standing in the world. Maria recovered her strength slowly, but with a quiet determination that impressed Eli. The first day she was on her feet, she wrapped her cut feet in rags, put on a pair of Jacob's old boots that Celia had found, and followed Eli to the barn. She spoke almost no English, and he knew only a handful of Spanish words, but the language of animals was universal. She moved among the horses with a calm, steady presence, her hands gentle but firm. She was not afraid of their size or their power. She mucked out the stalls, her movements fluid and efficient despite the pain that he knew she must be in. She had a toughness that her small frame belied, a resilience forged in a fire Eli could only guess at. A new rhythm took shape. Eli would ride out in the mornings to check on the cattle, his figure a dark speck against the blinding white snow. He would return to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, to the sight of Celia by the fire and Maria coming from the barn. They worked, they ate, they existed in a shared space, the sharp edges of their initial tension slowly worn down by the quiet routine of daily survival. One evening, they sat at the small table, sharing a simple meal of stew by the flickering lamplight. A strange peace had settled over the cabin. The silence was no longer heavy with suspicion, but comfortable, companionable. Eli found himself talking, telling them a story about his brother Jacob and a stubborn mule, a simple memory he had not shared with anyone. To his surprise, Celia laughed. It was not a polite, restrained sound, but a genuine, throaty laugh that lit up her face and made her seem years younger. The sound startled him. Then Maria smiled, a shy, tentative curve of her lips, and she said one of her few English words. "Good." The tension that had held them all captive seemed to break, to dissolve into the warm, lamp-lit air. After the meal, Celia sat on the floor by the hearth, brushing Maria's long, dark hair. which had become a tangled mess during her fever. Maria sat patiently, her eyes closed, as Celia's fingers worked gently through the knots. Eli sat in his chair in the shadows, watching them. He watched the careful, rhythmic motion of Celia's hands, the way the firelight caught the red highlights in her auburn hair and turned Maria's black hair to liquid silk. He saw the trust in the way Maria leaned into the touch, the quiet care in Celia's expression. Something stirred deep inside him, a feeling so foreign he could not put a name to it. It was a warmth, a hollow ache of longing, a profound confusion. These two women, these two separate streams of trouble, had flowed into his life and were now converging, creating a current that was pulling him along with them. For the first time in years, the cabin did not feel empty. It felt full, and that scared him more than any ghost. Celia's fingers paused in their task, her own ghosts rising to meet her. The simple, domestic act of caring for another woman brought a memory rushing back with the force of a physical blow. She was in her husband's library, the air thick with the smell of leather and cigar smoke. Jonathan was drunk, his face florid, his eyes holding the familiar glint of casual cruelty. He held a letter in his hand, a letter from her sister. He had taken to reading her mail, another small way to control her, to own her. "Your sister is concerned about your melancholy, my dear," he sneered, tossing the letter into the fire. "She does not understand that you have nothing to be melancholy about. You have a fine home, a respected name, a husband who provides for you." He came closer, his breath sour with brandy. He ran a hand over her hair, a gesture that was meant to be possessive but felt like a violation. "All I ask in return is a little gratitude, a smile. Is that too much to ask?" She had remained silent, her body rigid. His grip tightened in her hair, yanking her head back. "Look at me when I speak to you, Celia." His face was inches from hers, his smile a thin, cruel line. "Or perhaps you need a reminder of your duties." The trial was a blur of accusing eyes and whispered lies. Jonathan's family sat in the front row, dressed in black, their faces masks of performative grief. They spoke of her moods, her coldness, her unnatural interest in books about herbs and remedies. They painted her as a monster, a black widow who had lured their sainted brother to his doom. She sat in the dock, a pariah in her own community, the faces of her former friends turning away from her. Even her acquittal felt like a conviction. The verdict was not guilty, but the sentence was life, a life of shame and exile. Later, in the suffocating silence of her empty house, she had walked to the river. The water was dark and cold, a promise of peace, of an end to the whispers and the stares. She had stood on the bank for a long time, the polished stones of the path cool beneath her feet. She had taken a step, then another, the icy water swirling around her ankles, her skirts growing heavy. It was a release, a final surrender. But as the water reached her waist, a primal, unexpected will to live had surged through her. She was not Jonathan's victim. She was not society's scapegoat. She was Celia Hartwell. Gasping, sputtering, she had fought her way back to the shore, collapsing on the muddy bank, shivering and weeping, reborn in the cold dark. In the barn, as Maria groomed one of the horses, the rhythmic motion of the brush on the animal's coat soothed her. But the smell of the hay, the same smell that had greeted her when she had collapsed in this very barn, brought back its own ghosts. She remembered her uncle's house in New Mexico, the way he had looked at her not as family but as a commodity. He had shown her picture to the man, a rough American prospector with greedy eyes and stained teeth. "She is strong," her uncle had said in broken English, pushing her forward. "Good for work, good for a wife." The man had looked her over, walking around her as if she were a horse he was considering buying. He had grabbed her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. His touch was rough, his smell sour. She had felt a wave of nausea. $100. That was the price of her life. Her uncle had taken the money. his eyes avoiding hers. He had sold her. Her time with that man had been brief and brutal. He had not waited for a priest or a judge. He had taken what he believed he had paid for in the back of a filthy cantina, her silent tears the only witness to the transaction. The next day, he had put her on the caravan heading north, telling the wagon master she was his bride-to-be, meeting him in Wyoming. Her escape from the raid had been an escape from him, from a fate she could not bear to imagine. Her flight through the night, the fire at her back, had not just been a run for her life, it had been a run for her soul. This ranch, this quiet man, this kind woman, it was a sanctuary. It was the first place she had ever felt the possibility of safety. A week later, the world outside began to return. The snow melted under a strengthening sun, revealing the brown grass and muddy earth beneath. The fragile peace of their isolation was about to be tested. One night, a thunderstorm rolled in, the sky flashing with brilliant veins of lightning, the thunder shaking the very foundations of the small cabin. The storm outside was a mirror to the one that broke inside Eli. He was asleep on his cot when the first scream tore from his throat, a raw, ragged sound of pure terror. Maria was awake instantly. She saw him thrashing, his hands clenched, his face contorted in the grip of a nightmare. He was back in Kansas, the smell of gunpowder in his nostrils, the faces of the dead staring at him with empty, accusing eyes. Without thinking, Maria slid off the pallet where she now slept and went to him. She knelt by his cot, her heart aching at the raw pain in his voice. She placed her hands on his face, her palms cool against his feverish skin. "Está bien," she whispered, the Spanish words a soft, instinctive comfort. "It is all right. You are here. You are safe." At her touch, Eli's struggles ceased. His eyes flew open, wide and wild with the ghosts of his dream. He stared at her, his breathing harsh and ragged. He felt the impossible softness of her hands on his face, saw the deep, compassionate darkness of her eyes, and the nightmare began to recede, chased away by her presence. At that moment, a flicker of lightning illuminated the cabin's other occupant. Celia stood in the doorway of the small room she had claimed, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She had been woken by the scream. She saw them there, Maria kneeling over Eli, her hands cradling his face, his hand now covering hers, holding it there. Celia did not move. She did not speak. An ordinary woman might have felt a sting of jealousy, of suspicion. But Celia saw only two broken people finding a moment of solace in the dark. She saw the raw need in Eli's eyes and the profound, selfless comfort in Maria's. Instead of pulling away, Maria remained, her gaze steady on Eli. Then, slowly, she lifted her eyes to meet Celia's across the shadowed room. Eli turned his head, following her gaze. For a long, silent moment, the three of them were caught in that tableau. The thunder rumbled outside, a low growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. No one moved, no one spoke, but a question hung in the air, as potent and unspoken as a prayer. It was a question about loneliness, about comfort, about the strange and winding paths that had led three strangers to this one small room, to this one moment where their separate griefs had finally, irrevocably, touched. The spring thaw came not as a gentle awakening, but as a messy, reluctant surrender. The great mountains of snow slumped and wept, the water running in muddy rivulets that carved new paths through the fields. The air, once sharp and sterile, now carried the rich, dark scent of damp earth and the promise of new grass. The world was cracking open, and with it, the seal on their isolation. For weeks, the cabin had been a ship on a frozen sea. Now, land was in sight, and with it, the threat of other people. The first vessel to appear on the horizon was a man on horseback, Jed Stone, their nearest neighbor from 5 miles down the crooked creek. was a man whose curiosity was as vast as the prairie and as coarse as burlap. He rode up to the fence, a beefy figure with a weathered face and small, shrewd eyes that took in everything at once. He saw the smoke curling from Eli's chimney and, a moment later, Celia, who had stepped onto the porch to shake out a rug. "Well now, Dawson," Jed called out, his voice a hearty boom that grated on the morning quiet. "Thought that blizzard might have buried you for good. Good to see you're still breathing." Eli came out of the barn, his expression unreadable. He did not like Jed Stone, but on the frontier, a man did not have the luxury of choosing his neighbors. "Stone," he said, his voice a low rumble of acknowledgement. He walked to the fence but did not offer to open the gate. Jed's eyes slid past Eli to Celia, his gaze lingering with a slow, insolent appraisal. He then caught sight of Maria, who was leading one of the horses to the trough. A slow, knowing smirk spread across his face. He leaned forward on his saddle horn, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial leer. "Looks like you kept yourself warm this winter, Eli. Real warm." He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Eli's boot. "Heard tell a fancy southerner got turned away from the rocking R, and the girl, she looks like she might have gotten lost on her way up from the border. A man gets lonely out here. Can't say I blame you for housing two whores." The word hung in the clean spring air, ugly and venomous. Celia froze on the porch, her back ramrod straight, the rug clutched in her white-knuckled fist. Maria, though she did not understand the word, understood the tone. She stopped, her hand on the horse's neck, her body tensed. Eli did not say a word. He moved with a speed that was terrifying in its efficiency. In 2 long strides, he was at the fence. He reached over, grabbed a handful of Jed's woolen coat, and hauled the bigger man half out of his saddle. The punch was short and brutal, a solid crack of bone on bone. Jed's head snapped back, a grunt of pained surprise escaping his lips. He tumbled backward off his horse, landing in a heap in the mud. "Get off my land," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And if you ever speak of them that way again, I will not stop at one punch." Jed scrambled to his feet, wiping a trickle of blood from his split lip with the back of his hand. His face was a mask of fury and humiliation. "You'll regret this, Dawson. The whole territory will hear about this. Keeping a couple of strays in your house like they're decent folk." He clambered back onto his horse, shot one last hateful glare at the 3 of them, and galloped away, his shouted curses swallowed by the vastness of the prairie. An ugly silence descended. The confrontation had shattered the fragile peace of their sanctuary, letting the cold judgment of the world rush in. Eli turned, his face a hard mask of granite. He did not look at either woman. "It's over," he said, his voice flat. "He's right. The talk will start now. It is not safe for you here anymore. Pack what little you have. When the mud dries, I'll take you to town." Celia came down the porch steps, her eyes blazing with a fire Eli had not seen before. "And what is in town for us, Mr. Dawson? More men like that one, more whispers and accusations. I have been running from gossip since I left my home. I will not run anymore." Maria came to stand beside Celia, a small but unshakable presence. She looked at Eli, her dark eyes filled with a fierce plea. "Here, safe," she said, the 2 English words spoken with a conviction that outweighed 1,000 others. She placed a hand on her own chest. "I stay." Their unified front was a fortress he had not expected. He had seen them as victims of circumstance, 2 women he had a temporary duty to protect. He saw now that they had wills of their own, as strong and unbending as his. He looked from Celia's defiant chin to Maria's steady gaze. He saw the barn behind them, the one Maria had crawled into, half dead. The roof was partially collapsed from the weight of the snow, the timbers blackened from the raiders' fire. It was a ruin. So were they all. A long, shuddering breath escaped him. "Fine," he ground out, the word tasting of defeat and something else he could not name. "Stay, but do not say I did not warn you." He turned on his heel and strode toward the ruined barn. Grabbing an axe as he went, he began to attack the charred, broken timbers, his movements filled with a cold, controlled fury, as if he could dismantle the world's ugliness one splintered board at a time. The next morning, when he went to the barn, he found Celia and Maria already there, their sleeves rolled up. Celia was methodically pulling nails from salvaged planks, her brow furrowed in concentration. Maria was hauling debris away in a wheelbarrow, her movements strong and sure. They did not ask for his permission. They simply began to work. And so, the three of them began to rebuild. The labor was hard, a punishing physical toll that left their muscles aching and their hands raw. But in the shared effort, something new was being forged between them. Eli, with his quiet competence, showed them how to measure and saw, how to notch logs so they fit together, solid and true. He found himself explaining things, his voice losing some of its rusty edge. Celia, to his astonishment, was a quick study. The woman he had mistaken for a fragile doll had a mind as sharp as a tack and a surprising strength. Her hands, once soft and pale, became calloused and capable. She learned to swing a hammer with a steady, satisfying rhythm. Maria worked with a tireless energy, her small frame housing a spirit as resilient as prairie grass. She seemed to draw strength from the earth itself, her quiet persistence a constant, reassuring presence. In the long afternoons, under the warm spring sun, the sound of their work, the rasp of a saw, the rhythmic blow of a hammer, the murmur of their voices became a kind of music. Laughter, a sound Eli had long forgotten, began to find its way back into his life. It happened when a stray dog wandered onto the property and Maria tamed it with a piece of bacon, or when Celia, trying to carry a plank that was too long, got it stuck sideways in a doorway. They were small moments, but they were stitches, pulling the torn fabric of their lives back together. They were not just rebuilding a barn, they were building a home, right out in the open, in defiance of the world. The world, however, continued to knock. One afternoon, another rider appeared. This one was dressed in black, a Bible clutched in his hand. Reverend Miller was a gaunt man with eyes that burned with a cold fire. He had heard the talk in the settlement, the whispers of the lone cowboy and his two female companions. He dismounted and strode to the cabin, his gaze sweeping over their unconventional household with open disapproval. "I have come to offer you God's grace," he announced, his voice ringing with sanctimonious authority. "I have come to speak to you of the sin of living in defiance of his holy law." He directed his words at Eli, but his eyes condemned the women. "These women, they are lost sheep, and you, sir, are leading them further from the flock, down the path to damnation." Eli stopped his work, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. He looked at the preacher, his face calm. "Reverend," he said, his voice even, "we have seen more than our share of damnation. We are not in need of yours." He turned his back, picking up his hammer. "You can go now." The preacher, flustered by the quiet dismissal, sputtered for a moment. "But your souls! The fires of hell await those who—" "We know about fire, preacher," Eli cut in, not turning around. "We are done with it." He struck a nail, the single, sharp blow a clear and final punctuation. The preacher stood for another moment, then mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of righteous dust in his wake. That night, the work was done, and a deep, weary peace settled over the ranch. The moon was a perfect silver coin in a sky scattered with diamonds. They sat on the new porch of the half-built barn, the scent of fresh-cut pine sweet in the air. For a long time, no one spoke. It was Maria who broke the silence, her voice soft in the darkness. "In my village," she began, her English slow and careful, "the priest says to want something is a sin. To want touch is a sin for a woman." She looked at her hands, which lay clasped in her lap. "I am afraid. all my life. A man's touch. It is a hurt, a taking. She looked up, her gaze finding Eli's in the moonlight. Here, I am not afraid, but I feel guilty, to want to be safe, and also to want kindness. Is this a sin? Her raw vulnerability was an open wound. Celia reached out, placing a hand over Maria's. No, she said, her own voice thick with emotion. That is not a sin. It is the loneliest thing in the world. She looked out at the vast, dark prairie, her own past reflected in its emptiness. I was a wife. I lived in a fine house, and I was never warm. I never knew a man's kindness without cost. Every gentle word, every gift, was a down payment on something he would later demand of me in the dark. Her eyes met Eli's. I had forgotten what it felt like to not be afraid. Eli said nothing. He had no words to offer, no comfort he felt he had the right to give. Their confessions mirrored his own desolate loneliness, the guilt and the fear he lived with every day. He was a man whose hands had brought only death and destruction. What did he know of kindness? He rose and walked away, the weight of their words pressing down on him like a physical burden. The next morning, the air was still and cool. Maria was by the water pump, a large basin at her feet, preparing to wash her hair. Eli came out of the cabin, his movements stiff. He walked over to her, his shadow falling over her. She looked up, startled. Without a word, he took the bucket from her and began to work the pump, the squeak of the handle the only sound. He filled the basin, then gestured for her to sit on the small stool. Hesitantly, she did. He knelt behind her, rolling up his sleeves. Maria tensed as he reached for her hair, her body remembering a lifetime of rough, unwanted hands. But his touch was nothing like that. His large, calloused hands were impossibly gentle as he worked the soap into her long, thick hair. His movements were slow, careful, almost reverent. He said nothing, but the act itself was a language. It was an apology for Jed Stone, for the preacher, for the man who had bought her, for every man who had ever caused her pain. He was washing away more than just the dust of the trail. His hands trembled, a slight, betrayable tremor that spoke of his own nervousness, his own profound, unspoken need. Celia watched them from the cabin doorway, her heart aching with a feeling so complex she could not name it. It was not jealousy. It was a kind of awe. That night, the sky broke. A furious storm swept across the prairie, the wind screaming around the corners of the cabin, the rain lashing against the windows in violent sheets. The world was reduced to the creak and groan of the cabin walls and the thunderous beating of their own hearts. The air inside was electric, charged with all the things they had not said, all the things they had begun to feel. Eli stood by the window, watching the lightning tear jagged holes in the black sky. He felt as if the storm was inside him, a wild torrent of guilt and longing. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see Maria. She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the flashes of lightning. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the roar of the wind. She reached up, her small hand resting on his chest, right over his heart, and then she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was a simple kiss, soft and chaste, meant only as a gesture of gratitude, but it was a spark in a room filled with gunpowder. Eli froze, his mind reeling. He could feel the warmth of her hand through his shirt, the impossible softness of her mouth. He smelled the clean scent of her hair. He was aware of a movement across the room. Celia stood by the hearth, the firelight casting flickering shadows on her face. She was watching them. She did not look away. She did not move to leave. Her presence was not an intrusion, but an anchor, a silent, steady permission. The world seemed to slow down, to hold its breath. Eli looked from Maria's upturned face to Celia's watchful eyes. The space between the three of them hummed with a powerful, terrifying energy. He saw his own loneliness reflected in their eyes, his own brokenness, his own desperate yearning for a solace he never believed he would find. Slowly, as if in a dream, he lowered his head and kissed Maria again, more deeply this time, a kiss of shared sorrow and unspoken need. Then, still holding Maria's gaze, he reached out a hand to Celia. She came to him without hesitation, stepping into the circle of their charged silence. He looked at her, a question in his eyes he would never have dared to speak. Her answer was in the slight, trembling curve of her lips. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that tasted of rain and wood smoke and years of unshed tears. When he drew back, the three of them stood in the heart of the storm, their breathing ragged. Nothing more happened. It was enough. It was everything. A line had been crossed. A seal had been broken. The next day, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with the aftermath. They did not speak of what had happened. They did not need to. It was there in the way Eli's hand brushed Celia's as he passed her the coffee pot, the way Maria's eyes met his across the table and held for a moment too long. The silence was no longer empty. It was brimming with a raw, unspoken need, a terrifying and beautiful question to which none of them yet knew the answer. The days that followed were a quiet, careful dance. The kiss in the storm had been a flash of lightning, illuminating a strange and uncharted territory between them. Now, in the calm, sunlit days, they moved through that territory with a shared, unspoken reverence, as if the ground itself were sacred. They were not lovers. The word felt too simple, too coarse for the delicate web of glances, gestures, and silences that now connected them. But they were no longer strangers, either. They were three solitary souls who had seen the bottom of each other's wells of grief. They worked on the barn, their bodies moving in a new, instinctive harmony. Eli would cut a board, and Celia would be there to take it, her hand brushing his. Maria would climb the new frame with the agility of a cat, and Eli would be at the bottom, his feet planted solid, his eyes tracking her every move, ready to catch her if she fell. They ate their meals in a comfortable quiet, the scrape of a spoon in a bowl or the crackle of the fire the only sounds needed. A language was developing between them that had no need for words. It was in the way Celia placed a cup of coffee at Eli's elbow in the morning, the way Eli laid an extra blanket on Maria's pallet at night, the way Maria would sometimes pause in her work simply to watch the other two, a small, wondering smile on her face. But their quiet world could not remain an island. Eli's trips to the settlement for supplies became ordeals of cold silence. When he walked into the general store, conversations would halt in mid-sentence. Men who had once nodded a curt greeting now turned their backs. The storekeeper, a man named Abernathy, served him with a brisk, disapproving efficiency, his eyes never quite meeting Eli's. The poison Jedstone had spat had seeped into the town's well, and everyone was drinking from it. They called them sinners. They called the women witches, whores who had ensnared a lonely, grief-addled man. The gossip was a foul wind that blew from the town and rattled the windows of their small cabin. One afternoon, the wind took on a human form. A rider, slumped low in his saddle, approached the ranch. It was Silas Croft, a man known more for his thirst than his sense of decency. He was drunk, his movements sloppy, his face flushed with cheap whiskey and mean intentions. He stopped his horse near the new garden plot where Celia and Maria were working, turning over the rich, dark soil. "Well, looky here," Silas slurred, his words thick. "Dawson's little flock, working like they're decent folk." He fixed his bleary eyes on Maria. "You the Mexican one? Heard you was for sale. What's Dawson paying you? Maybe I can match his price." Maria straightened up, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists around her shovel. Celia stepped in front of her, a protective shield. "You are not welcome here," Celia said, her voice low and trembling with rage. "Leave now." Silas laughed, a wet, ugly sound. Or what? You gonna poison my drink? You fancy Charleston witch? He leaned over his saddle and spat. The glob of brown spittle landed in the dirt near Maria's feet. It was as if he had spat on a hornet's nest. Before Celia could react, the front door of the cabin flew open. Eli stood there, a rifle held loosely in his hands. He did not raise it. He did not need to. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes as cold and gray as death. He did not shout. His voice was a low, chilling whisper that carried with terrifying clarity. Silas, you have 10 seconds to turn that horse around. If you are still on my land when I count to 10, I will shoot your horse out from under you. Then I will break both of your arms. I will not kill you. I will just make it so you can never lift a bottle to your drunken mouth again. He took a step forward. 1. Panic flared in Silas's whiskey-fogged eyes. He saw no bluff in Eli's face, only the promise of swift and brutal violence. He fumbled with his reins, yanking the horse's head around so sharply that the animal whinnied in protest. He kicked it into a clumsy gallop, not looking back. Eli stood there until the rider was a small speck in the distance. He slowly lowered the rifle, the tension draining from his shoulders. He turned to the two women. Maria was shaking, her eyes wide with fear. Celia had her arm around her, holding her close. In that moment, Eli saw it with absolute clarity. They were a family, a strange, broken, besieged family, but a family nonetheless, and he would burn the world down to keep them safe. That night, the attack seemed to bind the women even closer. They sat on the porch, watching the stars ignite in the velvet sky, their voices a low murmur. They spoke of dreams, of a future they had never dared to imagine. "I've always wanted a garden with roses," Celia said, her voice wistful. "Old-fashioned ones, that smell so sweet it makes your heart ache." "Peppers," Maria said softly, "for cooking, and herbs. My grandmother. She knew all the herbs for healing." She looked around at the dark, looming shapes of the prairie. "And maybe some chickens, a cow for milk." She looked at Celia, a shy hope in her eyes. "Peace." "Yes," Celia whispered, taking Maria's hand. "Just peace." They were no longer just two women thrown together by fate. They were allies, fiercely protective of each other and of the fragile sanctuary they were building together. Later, inside, the mood was somber. The ugliness of the afternoon lingered. Eli had taken a bottle of whiskey from the small cabinet, a rare indulgence. He poured a small amount for Celia and a few drops for Maria, who looked at it with suspicion, and a heavy measure for himself. They drank in silence for a long time, the fire crackling in the hearth, the weight of the world pressing in on them. Eli drained his tin cup and poured another. The whiskey was doing its work, loosening the tightly bound knots of his control, letting the ghosts slip through the cracks. He stared into the flames, but he was not seeing them. He was seeing the plains of Kansas, smelling the gunpowder and the blood. "We were told they were raiders," he said suddenly, his voice a raw, gravelly thing. The women looked at him, startled. He had never spoken of the war. "Our scout, he was a liar. Or maybe he just saw what he wanted to see." He took a long, shuddering drink. "They were immigrants, from Germany. Their wagon was broken." His voice cracked, the sound of a man breaking apart from the inside. "There was a woman. She was knitting something. She just looked up at us, so surprised. And a boy. He had a little tin soldier in his hand." He put his head in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The dam had finally broken. All the guilt, the horror, the self-loathing he had carried in silence for years came pouring out. He wept. It was not the clean, dignified grief of a sad memory. It was a raw, tearing sound, the sound of a soul being ripped open. Celia and Maria did not hesitate. They moved as one. Maria knelt before him, taking his free hand in both of hers, holding it to her cheek. Celia came to stand behind his chair, her hands gently settling on his trembling shoulders. She leaned down, her lips pressing a soft, feather-light kiss to his hair, then to his temple. There was no passion in the touch, only a profound, boundless compassion. Maria cradled his head, her small hands stroking his hair, murmuring soft words in Spanish, a litany of comfort and solace. They stayed like that for a long time, anchoring him in the storm of his own memory. They did not recoil from his ugliness. They did not judge his weakness. They simply held him, offering their own quiet strength as a shield against his ghosts. He was not alone with them anymore. Later, when his tears were spent and a great, hollowed-out calm had settled over him, the night took a turn. The air in the cabin was charged, heavy with his raw vulnerability and their fierce, tender comfort. The lines between them had dissolved. He was no longer just their protector. He was a man they had held together as he fell apart. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, red light on their faces. Eli looked from Celia's compassionate eyes to Maria's steady, dark gaze. He saw his own brokenness reflected there, but he also saw an acceptance so complete it stole his breath. He reached out, his hand finding Celia's. He turned his other hand over, lacing his fingers with Maria's. That night, the final line was crossed. It was not a surrender to lust, but a quiet, deliberate act of healing. It was slow, trembling, and shared. There was a reverence to their touches, an exploration of scars both visible and hidden. Their bodies became a language, speaking of forgiveness, of acceptance, of a deep and desperate need to find solace in a cruel world. There was no taking, only offering, no ownership, only a shared, trembling discovery. In the soft, firelit darkness of the cabin, three broken people found a way to piece each other back together, finding a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. It was a bond forged in grief, sealed in compassion, and finally, consummated in a tenderness that none of them had ever known. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The world outside was unchanged, but inside the cabin, everything was different. A sweet, awkward silence hung in the air. Maria, her cheeks a deep shade of crimson, was intensely focused on frying bacon, refusing to look up. Celia, a small, secret smile playing on her lips, poured coffee with a steady hand, a quiet laugh escaping her when she caught Eli's eye. Eli, for his part, could not seem to meet either of their gazes for more than a second. He felt raw, exposed, and deeply, terrifyingly hopeful. The days that followed fell into a new kind of harmony. They worked, they ate, they lived, but now, at night, they came together, their shared bed a sanctuary against the night and the judgment of the world. They were building something real, a life stitched together from the remnants of their broken pasts. They were happy. The happiness lasted for 3 weeks. Then, the sheriff came. He rode up one afternoon, not alone. A younger, nervous-looking deputy rode with him. Sheriff Brody was a tall, weary man with a kind face and the sad eyes of someone who had seen too much trouble. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. Eli met him on the porch, his body a solid, unmoving wall. Celia and Maria stood in the doorway behind him. "Eli," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with regret, "I'm not here for a social call." "Never figured you were Brody," Eli said, his voice low. The sheriff took off his hat, turning it over in his hands. He looked past Eli to where Maria stood, her face pale. "Eli, a man filed a claim in Cheyenne, a legal claim. Says he bought and paid for a bride from New Mexico. Says she was on a caravan that was raided, and that he's tracked her here." He took a deep breath. "He has papers, Eli, a bill of sale, signed by her uncle. He's on his way here now, with a circuit judge. The law says she belongs to him." The words fell like stones into the quiet afternoon. A bill of sale belongs to him. the fragile piece of their world shattered. The past had come for them, not with a drunk's curses, but with the full, inexorable weight of the law. Maria let out a small, wounded sound, like a trapped animal. Sheriff Brody looked at the three of them, at the fierce, protective way Eli stood before the two women, at the defiant terror in their eyes. His own gaze was filled with a deep, weary pity. "You have a choice to make, Eli," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You can run, you can fight, or you can surrender her. I'm telling you now, so you have time to decide. He'll be here by morning." The sheriff's departure left a silence that was heavier and more suffocating than the deepest winter snow. The world, which had just begun to open up with the promise of spring, had snapped shut again, its jaws tightening around their fragile sanctuary. Maria stood frozen in the doorway, her face a mask of such stark terror that it seemed to crack. The color had drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin the color of old parchment. She was no longer the resilient woman who had helped rebuild a barn. She was the terrified girl again, running from fire and violence. "He has the paper," she whispered, her voice a reedy, broken thing. Her eyes were fixed on some distant horror only she could see. "I am the thing on the paper." "No," Celia said, her voice sharp and fierce. She went to Maria, taking her by the shoulders. "You are not a thing. You are a woman. You are Maria." But Maria was shaking her head, her body trembling uncontrollably, caught in the grip of a past that had just become her present. Eli watched them, a cold, hard knot tightening in his gut. He had known this peace was fragile, a temporary shelter built on borrowed time. He had fought his own ghosts for years, but this was a different kind of monster, one with a legal document and the sanction of the law. Running was the sensible option. They could be gone by nightfall, swallowed by the vastness of the territory. They could disappear. But he looked at the home they had started to build, the half-finished barn, the neat rows of the new garden, the faint but unmistakable scent of Celia's roses that had just begun to bud. He looked at Maria's terror and Celia's defiant rage. To run would be to surrender a piece of their souls. He walked over to Maria, kneeling so that he could look her in the eye. He took her trembling hands in his. They were as cold as ice. "Maria," he said, his voice low and steady, a rock in the churning sea of her fear. "Listen to me." He waited until her terrified gaze finally met his. "No man owns you." He gave her hands a gentle squeeze, his touch firm and reassuring. "Not him, not your uncle." He paused, his own confession a quiet, powerful vow. "Not even me. You belong to yourself. We will not run." He looked up at Celia, whose eyes were shining with unshed tears. "We will fight." The decision, once made, settled over them with a grim finality. Their first move was a desperate appeal to the very system that threatened to destroy them. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Eli rode for town. He was not seeking supplies this time, but justice. There was one lawyer in the settlement, a man named Phineas Cole, whose office was a dusty room above the saloon. Eli knew it was a fool's errand, but he had to try. The town received him with an open, festering hostility. As he rode down the main street, men stopped and stared, their faces hard with judgment. At the saloon, where he had to pass to get to Cole's office, a group of men were gathered on the boardwalk. Jed Stone was among them. As Eli passed, one of the men hawked and spat, the brown wad of tobacco landing in the dust a mere inch from Eli's boot. It was a calculated, deliberate insult, a clear message. He was an outcast. He and his women were filth. Eli's hand tightened on the reins, his knuckles white, but he kept his face a mask of stone and walked on. Phineas Cole was a small, balding man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the nervous energy of a trapped bird. He listened to Eli's story, his fingers drumming a constant, agitated rhythm on his cluttered desk. When Eli had finished, Cole took off his spectacles and polished them with a corner of his vest. a gesture of profound discomfort. "Mr. Dawson," he said, avoiding Eli's gaze, "I sympathize with your position. Truly, I do, but the law in this matter is unambiguous. A contract is a contract. A bill of sale, properly witnessed and filed, is a legally binding document. The girl is, in the eyes of the law, chattel, property." "She is a human being," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "A fact that has very little legal standing in this particular circumstance," Cole said with a sigh. "To fight this would be to fight the very foundations of contract law. It would be expensive, lengthy, and I can tell you with near certainty, ultimately futile. I am sorry. I cannot take your case." He put on his spectacles, the conversation clearly over. Eli left without another word, the contempt of the town clinging to him like a shroud. Back at the ranch, Celia made her own desperate gamble. She sat at the small table, a pen in her hand, a piece of fine stationery before her, one of the last vestiges of her former life. Her elegant, looping script, once the pride of her Charleston finishing school, felt like a mockery now, but she wrote with a fierce, determined urgency. The letter was to a territorial senator, a man who had been a friend of her father's, a man who had once bounced her on his knee at a garden party. She did not plead or beg. She stated her case with a cool, logical clarity, appealing to his sense of decency, to their shared history, to the honor of a gentleman. She spoke of a young woman in grave danger, of a miscarriage of justice. She sealed the letter, her hopes, as thin and fragile as the paper itself, enclosed within. The letter would be sent with a freight driver the next day. It would take weeks to reach the capital. Weeks they did not have. It was a shot in the dark, and she knew it. The name Hartwell, once a key that could open any door, was now just a word associated with scandal and poison. It was worthless. With the avenues of law and influence closed to them, only one path remained, the path of violence. The ranch became a training ground, a fortress preparing for a siege. The air grew tense with the grim purpose of their preparations. Eli took Celia out to the field behind the barn and placed a rifle in her hands. It was heavy and awkward, the cold metal of brutal reality against her shoulder. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You aim low. You squeeze the trigger. You do not pull it." He stood behind her, his hands guiding hers, his body a warm, solid presence. She flinched at the first deafening blast, the powerful kick of the rifle bruising her shoulder, but she did not drop it. She squared her stance, her jaw set, and fired again, and then again, until the smell of gunpowder was thick in the air and her movements became steady and sure. The Southern belle was dead and buried, a frontier woman, with iron in her spine and a rifle in her hands, was being born in her place. Maria did not take to the rifle. The sound of gunfire brought back the horror of the raid, her eyes growing wide with a hunted look. Instead, she took the large knives from the kitchen and a whetstone from the barn. She sat on the porch steps for hours, the rhythmic, grating sound of steel on stone, a grim counterpoint to the chirping of the birds. She sharpened each knife to a razor's edge, her movements precise and deadly. She was not preparing to be a victim again. The night before the man was due to arrive, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the cabin. They ate their dinner without speaking, each lost in their own fears. Maria was terrified. She moved like a ghost, her face pale, her eyes enormous. After the meal, Eli found her in the barn, her arms wrapped around the neck of her favorite horse, her face buried in its mane. He stood beside her for a long time before speaking. "He will not take you," he said softly. She turned to him, her face wet with silent tears. "How? How can you stop him? He has the law." "Then the law is wrong," Eli said, his conviction a solid, unshakable thing. "Some things are more important than a piece of paper. Your life is more important." He reached out, his rough hand gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. We will stand with you, Maria, Celia and I. We will stand right here, no matter what happens. The morning dawned gray and cheerless, the sky the color of old pewter. They were ready. They did not have to wait long. Just after 9, a small procession appeared on the horizon. A black carriage, looking like a hearse, was flanked by 2 deputies on horseback. The carriage pulled up before the cabin, and 2 men emerged. The first was a man in his 50s with a stern, imposing face and the black robes of a circuit judge. The second was a stout, florid man with a proprietary gleam in his eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. This was Amos Blackwood, Maria's buyer. He looked at the cabin, at the 3 figures standing on the porch, as if he were surveying a piece of property he had already purchased. Judge Sterling, Blackwood, and the 2 deputies approached the porch. Eli stood in the center, a solid, unmoving pillar. Celia and Maria stood on either side of him, their shoulders touching. "I am Judge Sterling," the judge announced, his voice a powerful baritone used to commanding courtrooms. "I am here to enforce a legal claim of property filed by Mr. Amos Blackwood." He gestured to the stout man beside him. Blackwood stepped forward, a smug smile on his face. He held up a piece of paper. "I have a bill of sale for the woman, Maria Reyes," he said, his eyes devouring Maria, who flinched but held her ground. "I have come to collect my property." "She is not property," Eli said, his voice dangerously low. The judge raised an eyebrow. "That is not for you to decide. Sir, the law is clear. Now, stand aside and let Mr. Blackwood take the item in question." At the word item, something in Celia snapped. She stepped forward, her green eyes flashing with a cold fire. "You will do no such thing," she said, her voice ringing with an authority the judge had not expected. "This woman is not for sale. She is a member of this family." She turned to Eli, placing her hand on his arm, her gaze unwavering. "I am his wife, and she is with us." Before the judge could respond, Maria stepped forward as well, her fear replaced by a desperate, blazing courage. She looked directly at the judge, her chin high. She placed her hand on Eli's other arm. "I am his wife," she said, her voice shaking but clear, the words a defiant claim of belonging, a shield against the man who wanted to own her. The 3 of them stood there, a united, unshakable front. Judge Sterling was taken aback. He scoffed, a sound of derisive disbelief, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something else. He was a man of the law, of papers and precedents, but he was not a fool. He saw what was before him, not a man and 2 whores, but 3 fierce souls bound by something he could not comprehend. 3 people who looked as if they were perfectly willing to burn for each other. Amos Blackwood, however, saw only defiance. His face purpled with rage. "Wife," he spat. "She is my bride. I paid for her." He started up the steps, his hand outstretched to grab Maria. "You are coming with me, girl." It happened in a heartbeat. Eli let out a low growl and moved to intercept him. One of the deputies, seeing the situation escalating, drew his pistol and fired a warning shot into the air. But in the tense, chaotic moment, his aim was unsteady. The bullet ripped through the porch roof, sending splinters flying, and a piece of the shrapnel sliced across Maria's arm, opening a bloody gash. She cried out, a sharp sound of pain and shock. The sight of her blood, the sound of her cry, broke something in Eli. The cold, controlled man vanished, and something wild and primal took his place. A killing rage, born on a bloody field in Kansas, erupted. With a roar, he lunged past the deputy and seized Blackwood by the throat, lifting the heavier man clean off his feet and slamming him against a porch post. Eli's fingers dug into Blackwood's neck, his thumbs pressing down, his face a mask of terrible, murderous fury. Blackwood's eyes bulged, his face turning a ghastly shade of blue as he clawed uselessly at Eli's iron grip. The deputies shouted, raising their pistols. Judge Sterling stood frozen in horror, At that moment, Celia, who had rushed to Maria's side, acted. She grabbed the rifle that was leaning against the cabin wall, aimed it at the sky, and fired. The blast was deafening, shocking everyone into a moment of stillness. "Enough!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos. The sound of the rifle shot, of her voice, penetrated the red haze of Eli's rage. He blinked, his focus returning. He looked down at the gasping, choking man in his hands and, with a shuddering groan, released him. Blackwood collapsed to the ground, wheezing and sobbing. Into this tense, broken silence, a new sound emerged, the thunder of hoofbeats. A group of riders was approaching. Fast. It was Jed Stone and several other ranchers from the surrounding area. They had seen the judge's carriage and had come to see the spectacle. But Jed did not look at Eli with his usual contempt. He looked at the blubbering, pathetic figure of Amos Blackwood on the ground. "That him?" Jed asked Sheriff Brody, who had just ridden up, drawn by the sounds of the gunshots. "That the fella claiming the girl?" Brody nodded. Jed spat on the ground. "I'll be a witness," he said. "That man came through here last year, bought another girl, a poor thing from back east. Worked her near to death, beat her black and blue. She ran off one night, and nobody ever saw her again. He's a monster." Another rancher stepped forward. "He's right. Blackwood tried to buy my daughter, offered me $500. When I refused, he threatened to burn my place down. He's bad news." One by one, the ranchers, men who had shunned Eli, spoke up, not for him, but against Amos Blackwood. They were hard men, but they had their own codes, their own lines that would not be crossed. The judge listened, his expression grim. He looked at the cowering Blackwood, at the testimony of the local men, and at the three defiant figures on the porch, one of them bleeding. The paper in Blackwood's hand meant nothing now. It was a contract with a devil, and this small corner of Wyoming was refusing to honor it. Judge Sterling slammed his gavel, an imaginary one, down on the porch rail. "The claim is dismissed," he declared, his voice ringing with finality. "Mr. Blackwood, you will be escorted from this territory. If you ever show your face here again, you will be arrested for any number of crimes I am certain we can find." He turned to Eli, Celia, and Maria. He did not smile, but the hard line of his mouth softened. "Your household is irregular, but it appears to be an honest one." He turned and walked back to his carriage, a man who had seen the law bend to the weight of simple human decency. The townspeople watched as the deputies hauled a protesting Amos Blackwood away. Then their gazes fell upon the trio on the porch. The whispers of whore and sinner had died. What they saw now was something different. They saw a quiet, scarred man who had been willing to face down the law and kill for his own. They saw two women, one a disgraced lady and the other a foreign stray, who had stood beside him, unbowed. They did not see a scandal anymore. They saw a fortress. They saw a family forged in fire. And they were in awe. When they were all gone, the three of them stood alone in the sudden, ringing silence. They were exhausted, emotionally and physically battered. Eli gently took Maria's arm, inspecting the wound. It was shallow, but it was bleeding freely. "Let's get you inside," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He led her into the cabin, with Celia following close behind. They were bloodied, but as they crossed the threshold into the safety of their home, they were, for the first time, truly and completely triumphant. The confrontation on the porch was a crucible, burning away the last of their fear and solidifying them into something new, something strong and unyielding. In its aftermath, time began to flow differently. It was no longer a thing to be endured, a countdown to the next disaster, but a river, carrying them forward into a season of quiet, steady growth. The ranch flourished. The scars of fire and neglect slowly faded under the relentless care of their three sets of hands. The new barn, its pine boards weathering to a soft, silvery gray, became the heart of their homestead. A small herd of cattle, bought with the money from the sale of Jacob's old prospecting equipment, grew fat on the summer grass. Chickens scratched in the yard, their contented clucking a constant, gentle rhythm to the days. A milk cow, a placid creature with soulful brown eyes, provided them with more cream and butter than they could possibly need. Each of them found their own domain within this burgeoning world. Maria's hands, which had once been sold for labor, now worked for love. She cultivated a garden that became a riot of life and color. She planted rows of beans, squash, and corn, and a special plot for the peppers and herbs of her childhood. Their sharp, savory scents, a comforting piece of a home she had thought was lost to her forever. Along the new porch Eli had built, she tended to a wild rose garden. The bushes grew thick and tangled, their blossoms not the prim. Perfect flowers of Celia's memory, but tough, vibrant explosions of pink and red that filled the air with a sweet, untamed fragrance. The garden was her peace, a place where she could feel the pulse of the earth and know that she, too, had finally put down roots. Celia, who had once presided over silent, formal drawing rooms, found a new and far more boisterous calling. The barn, once a place of ruin, became a place of learning. Word had spread of the educated woman on the Dawson Ranch, and soon, the children of the surrounding homesteads began to appear at their gate. Celia, with a quiet grace that commanded respect, taught them to read and write, to do sums, and to see the world beyond their small corner of Wyoming. She held her classes in the hayloft, the scent of hay and horses a strange but fitting incense for her makeshift school. She was no longer Celia Hartwell, the disgraced widow. She was Mrs. Dawson, the teacher, a woman of purpose and value, her worth measured not by a husband's name but by the bright, eager faces of her students. Eli, the silent man haunted by a past of destruction, became a creator. He was a man who spoke best with his hands, and his hands were rarely still. He expanded their world, board by board. He built a second, smaller cabin a short distance from the first, its windows looking out over the creek. It was meant for the women, a space of their own. But when it was finished, no one moved. The original cabin, with its shared warmth and tangled histories, was their true home. So, Eli built a bridge between the two structures, a wide, covered walkway, turning two separate buildings into one sprawling, unconventional home. The walkway became their favorite spot, a place to sit in the evenings and watch the sun bleed across the vast, empty sky. The judgment of the outside world had not vanished, but it had lost its power to wound them. When they rode to town for supplies, they rode together. The stares and whispers still followed them, but they were met with a quiet, united dignity that offered no crack for the poison to enter. They had built their own world on the edge of the Badlands, a world with its own laws, its own customs, its own fierce and tender heart. The opinions of others were like the wind, audible, but ultimately unable to touch the solid foundation of their home. They had stopped caring, and in that they had found a profound and unshakable freedom. One evening in the thick heat of late summer, the air was still and heavy, promising a thunderstorm that never came. The day's work was done, and the women, seeking relief from the oppressive heat, went down to the creek that snaked through the cottonwood trees at the edge of the property. Eli was in the woods, checking a line of traps he had set, when he heard the sound of their laughter, a light, musical sound that drew him closer. He stopped at the edge of the trees, hidden in the deep shadows of the twilight. Below him, in a shallow, sandy pool where the water ran clear and cool, Celia and Maria were bathing. The setting sun cast a golden, syrupy light through the leaves, dappling their skin. Maria was sitting on a smooth, flat rock, her long black hair cascading down her back. Celia stood behind her, scooping up handfuls of water and letting it run through Maria's hair, washing it with a slow, gentle tenderness. They were speaking in low, murmuring voices, their laughter bubbling up and echoing in the quiet grove. Eli watched, his heart catching in his throat. He felt no lust, no possessive fire. What he felt was a profound, overwhelming awe. He was not seeing two bodies. He was seeing the soul of his new life laid bare. He saw the trust, the easy affection, the deep, unshakable bond between these two women he had come to love. He saw their scars, the faint white lines on Celia's wrists, the puckered burn mark on Maria's shoulder from the raid. He saw their strength, their beauty, their impossible resilience. This, he thought, this quiet moment of peace and tenderness in the fading light, this was the thing he had fought for. This was the thing he would die for. He backed away slowly, as silently as he had come, leaving them to their sanctuary, his own soul filled with a reverence so deep it felt like a prayer. That night, the cabin was filled with a quiet, humming intensity. When the women came back from the creek, their hair damp and smelling of soap and fresh water, they found Eli waiting. He did not say where he had been, and they did not ask. But something had shifted. The last wall around his heart, the final guarded corner of his soul, had crumbled. When they came together in the soft darkness of their shared bed, it was different than all the nights that had come before. It was a final, unconditional surrender. All the shame, all the guilt, all the ghosts of their pasts were exorcised in the deep, profound honesty of their touch. It was not a feverish passion, but a slow, reverent reunion, a final coming home. In the quiet aftermath, they lay tangled together, the sound of their breathing the only sound in the room, their bodies a language of complete and total acceptance. Celia stirred, her voice a soft whisper in the darkness. "We are not broken anymore." Maria, her head resting on Eli's chest, replied, her own voice thick with a truth that was as old and elemental as the earth itself. "We were never broken, just burned." Time moved on, turning the green of summer to the gold of autumn, then to the stark white of winter, and back to green again. One evening, years later, the three of them sat on the covered walkway that joined their two cabins. Eli sat in the middle, a woman tucked securely under each arm. The ranch was quiet. The animals settled for the night, the children's lessons from the barn long since finished. On the far horizon, a prairie fire painted the darkening sky in brilliant, terrifying strokes of orange and red. It was miles away, a beautiful, deadly spectacle. A few years ago, the sight would have sent a spike of primal fear through all three of them. It was the fire of Eli's nightmares, the fire of Maria's escape, the fire of a society's judgment. But now, they did not flinch. They did not run for water buckets or look at each other with fear in their eyes. They simply watched, their hands intertwined, a single, unbreakable unit. Eli felt Celia's head rest on his shoulder, felt Maria's fingers tighten in his. The fire no longer threatened them. It could not reach them here, in the sanctuary they had built from the ashes of their former lives. It was just a part of the landscape now, a wild and beautiful force of nature. From this distance, from the safety of their home, the fire no longer felt like a threat. It was just light now, and warmth. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are listening from, so please comment below and connect with others. We invite you to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.